This episode of the Fine Homebuilding podcast is brought to you by Loctite's Tight Foam. The best builders take weatherization seriously. When they need to seal a gap that's too small for insulation but big enough to create a draft, they reach for Loctite's Tight Foam. With 3 formulations for everything from small cracks to the biggest gaps, there's a tight foam product for every job, including a low expanding product designed to seal the rough opening around windows and doors. The high-density foam forms a tenacious bond to most common building materials, stays flexible to prevent cracking when materials move, and keeps air, moisture, and pests out of the house. Builders who care about energy efficiency, comfort, and durability choose Tight Foam. Visit LoctiteProducts.com for more information. Who's thinking about this when they're blasting their siding with a pressure washer? Nobody.
I think every pressure washer who washes the exterior of a house needs to have a license and be trained on how not to wreck the house wrap that's underneath.
I gotta say, the guy in my neighborhood has had very little training, if I had to guess. Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding Podcast, our weekly discussion of building, remodeling, and design topics aimed at anybody who cares deeply about the craft and science of working on houses. This is Senior Editor Patrick McComb. Today I'm joined by Fine Homebuilding Editorial Advisor Mike Girton.
Howdy.
Operations Manager for TDS Custom Construction Ian Schwant.
Hello.
And our rock-steady producer Jeff Rose.
Hi there.
You can find previous podcasts and check out the show notes at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. Please email your questions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. It's great to see you guys. Thanks for being here.
I'm excited to be here and be corrected in real time by Mike Girton as opposed to down the road in email form.
It's nothing, no low blow swings or anything. It's just little things. You get 99.98% of the things correct, so that's good.
I'm
God,
happy
I can
about
only hope
that.
to get half of that stuff right.
I always enjoy when you and Doug Horgan write in to correct us. Those are some of my favorite letters.
Mine too, and it makes the show better, honestly, right? If we're spouting garbage, it's good to have someone call us on it.
All the listeners are good about that too.
Yeah, agreed. Jeff, so you've been working on a video series, a learning educational seminar, right, about dovetailing. Can you talk about that?
It's everything from the very basics to machine-assisted dovetails and just how to do it and why to do it. And
who's teaching this?
It's Bob Van Dyke, who's the founder of Connecticut Valley School of Woodworking. So he's been doing it for 20-some-odd years.
So you went to his place and videoed him doing this. Yeah. And are you cutting this together now as the class? Is that how that's working?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Are you sick to death of dovetails?
No, actually, I'm sick of watching them. I want to go make some,
Sure. Have you learned anything?
Oh, yeah. I always learn something new, even though, I've seen this stuff for years. It's like, okay, that's a different take on it,
Cool. And folks can find this at Fine Woodworking when?
The class launches beginning in November, I think the 2nd. So
awesome.
Bob's got a great facility, and I think it's in Manchester, right? Manchester, Connecticut.
Yeah, it's a fantastic facility, and it's right adjacent to a Woodcraft, so you can just run in and buy whatever you need.
That sounds deadly. And what is this series called?
Dovetail Boot Camp.
That's awesome. Ian, you're getting ready to go on a fabulous European vacation, am I right?
Yeah, like I won Price is Right or something. It's been on our radar to go visit our friends that we got to know in New York who then moved to England. I've one friend that lives in London that we're going to stay with for a few days, and then my former shop mate, Alan Webb, classically trained English carver, bought a 1600s decommissioned church in Wales and turned that into his studio and living space. So we're going to drive from London to Wales and spend some time there. And then because my wife is a chef and we're foodies, we have to go to Paris for a couple of days and gorge ourselves.
That sounds absolutely incredible.
Yeah, we've been planning it since maybe early summer. We committed to go, but there's nothing like free places to stay to make a vacation like that more doable.
Also, more enjoyable, right? Like having someone on the ground there, that's hugely helpful.
Yeah, just the amount of work that both of them have put into making sure that we don't screw up this one chance at having a really great vacation by making bad decisions and expecting trains to run on time and run at full schedule on the weekend. We learned we couldn't expect that.
Well, I hope you have an amazing time. I'm sure it's not been easy to get ready for this trip given your job.
No, and I was in D.C. for the Remodelers Advantage Production Manager Roundtable Conference last week. So I've got 1 week of work sandwiched between two trips. So
you've got 3 weeks of work.
Yeah, exactly.
And the crazy boat deck is finished, am I right?
Yeah, the guys really knocked that out. We had a delay in that lead carpenter's next project, so he and his partner that was working with him on that really blasted through the work, and it turned out pretty cool. And it was especially rewarding for me because I've been working with the design team and the engineer on that one for over a year to get that right.
I bet you're happy to be done with that.
I was happy that it was becoming a tangible thing that you could go stand on and jump up and down on to see if it was actually going to have any of the tippiness that the engineer was concerned about.
And it was solid?
Yeah, it's really solid. It's got a bunch of PT LVL built into it, a lot of very expensive heavy-duty Simpson hangers. A lot went into it, and our guys did the concrete work themselves because we couldn't find anybody on our schedule. So I'm really proud of the work they did on the project from start to finish.
And
it looks amazing.
That concrete wall underneath that supports the whole thing, I mean, that really sets it off. It gives it that sort of a keel appearance.
Yep.
Yeah.
When it was all formed up, Mike, I said it was a shame that the formwork was going to come off because it was amazing in itself. It was a shame. It was, just there to hold the concrete.
Yeah, no, they stepped out of their comfort zone for that project, that's for sure.
So in the after show, I would love to talk about a couple things you brought up, Ian. One was your time at the Remodelers Advantage, and the other was the lack of affordable housing that's being built in this country. So stay tuned, folks, for that.
Was a great article recently in the New York Times about that affordable housing question, and I think we as builders often read those articles and scoff when they blast us for our output as part of the reason for lack of affordable housing. And this particular author did not go there and focused much more on some of the things that we've talked about previously on the podcast. So I look forward to digging into that more in the after show.
Mike, what have you been up to? Have you had anyone to come out to your central air conditioning system in your Tucson house?
Well, we're not there, so it's anything you do long distance, calling somebody up and then communicating, it's just better left to wait till we're there. That way I can,
keep
talk to folks. Yeah. Well, no, but I want to learn, really it comes down to somebody coming out that in an area I'm not familiar with, in a building, systems that I'm not familiar with, and then just picking their brain. And two people I have talked to when I was out there during the summer, it's like they're anxious to share their little bits of pieces of information, which is great. And then me having a little experience and knowing the language, it helps. So I can ask them questions and they can, point out the mistakes on the way I'm thinking about things and then point me in the right direction. So it's good for both of us.
We talked a little bit ahead of the show about, it's pretty evident that seasons are changing. Today it was 47, I think, here in Newtown. And the thing that points it out to me are the mice are trying to get into the house, which I had the joy of experiencing this morning at like 3:30 in the morning, because they're industrious little suckers. Oh my gosh. Do you guys have a solution for this problem living in an old house?
Blower door test, find the leaks, you seal up the leaks, and you seal the mice out.
And it's, as I recall, spray foam with steel wool in it, right?
That's one way, or just using some wire mesh over the holes before you then fill them. Staple up some, some 1/4-inch, steel mesh. Yeah.
Do you get these calls from your tenants, Mike, about, yeah.
And they're all old homes built in the, between the 50s and the early 60s, so they're full of those spots. The most difficult challenge I found is keeping them out of the attic. I can keep them out of the envelope of the house, the thermal envelope, the inside, but I can't figure out how to keep them from getting up in the attic, and I can't figure out how they're getting in there. All the soffit vents are, got the grates on them, and every avenue that I can see, I got to put a little GPS tracker on one, and then, when it's inside, and then watch them when they leave.
Martin Holliday set up a game cam when he was trying to figure out how they were getting in his house, and he learned that they were coming in around the thimble that was for their direct vent on-demand hot water heater. And apparently, this is a problem that Renai knows about, and they had a solution, but I thought that was pretty clever. I would need 100 game cams to monitor all the spots in my house that they seem to show up. Jeff, do you have this problem?
I do. I for years we didn't, and I definitely have some up in the attic above our bedroom, which has no access from the house. Actually has no access at all. Because it's
apparently the mice are finding access.
For me.
Well, I welcome any of our smart listeners to, come and solve my mouse problem. That would be great. So I got to do a blower door test and spend some time plugging holes, right, Mike? Yeah.
Pretty much.
Sounds fun. So this comes from Austin. Hey, podcasters. Austin, crazy DIYer from Columbus here. I was just listening to Andrew talk about insulating between his floors to help with sound transmission. Well, I have 1x subflooring with pretty big gaps on my first floor, and I too was concerned about how the sound would transmit between floors. In my case, between the basement and the first floor. So I did a little research and landed on Styco, natural acoustic wood fiber underlayment from Lowe's. It comes in rigid green 24 by 36 by 8-inch thick sheets. They were super simple to install. I used 2 layers with offset seams, and I nailed my hardwood flooring right over it, using a slightly longer nail to compensate for the extra 1/4 inch, and it works great. I was really just hoping for something to take the edge off between the floors, but I have to say it works way better than I expected, and it wasn't very expensive compared to other options. If you also stuffed your joists with rock wool, I think you'd have almost no ambient sound transmission. It won't help with foot sounds, but that's a whole lot of physics. All right, keep up the good work. I swear I'm going to write with an update soon. It's just that it's going to be a George R.R. Martin length novel, so I, like Martin, am having a hard time sitting down to finish it. In the meantime, here's some pics of my little crew of friends working on the floor. Oh, and we used the rosin paper mainly to keep the green dust from the underlayment from snowing down into the basement for the foreseeable future. Best, Austin. Well, thanks, Austin. What do you guys think about this green 1/8-inch thick sound transmission stuff?
I went to the website, and when you see marketing information that touts more benefits than will fit in a 3x5 card, you got to start wondering, what is this product really here to do? It may function perfectly well for what Austin was using it for, but it also does a lot of other things.
It holds up elephants.
It does. It holds up elephants. It also it has thermal properties, which are great over a concrete slab when you put your flooring on to keep your floor warm. It also works great over a radiant floor. So there's kind of a disconnection there. If anybody knows about the way we should,
energy moves. Yeah.
Yeah, with heat moving, but it does a lot of things.
Well, in Austin's situation where he's decoupling, right? He's separating his finished floor from the framing, and I think it would probably help quite a bit there.
Yep. And it provides that, it does have some mass to it, so that's going to help with the sound transmission. And one point that Austin did put in there, I'm actually picking up more than just the green material, is putting down the rosin paper over an old plank sheathed floor. And we've all pulled up hundreds of old houses where they've put down either tar paper or rosin paper down before they put whatever the floor finishes are. And it is an effective way. In fact, I've taken up old houses where it's just newspaper back from the 1800s, which is fun for us at lunchtime reading all the old stuff. But putting the newspaper down, so any dirt particles that get through your hardwood flooring or whatever the finished flooring is, they can migrate over time and then rain down into that lower level. So by putting down that rosin paper, it solves that problem even today.
And it decouples the floor from the subfloor, which is useful, right, with changes in humidity and season. And I would argue it probably helps a little with sound, too, because sound moves way more readily through a hole than it does, through a solid material. So.
Yep.
Cool. I love the ads in those old newspapers, Mike. That's the best part for me, right?
Yep.
Get your cast iron stove for $8.95.
I like it when you find the old car ads and you find the new car for $700.
This is a long one from our friend Dave in Vermont, but it's great. So bear with me, folks. Here we go.
Kylie's not here, so I can refer to this letter as very Vermonty.
Hi, all. I've been working on a small job that's far from my house, so I've had a chance to listen to more podcasts lately. As always, you all are doing a great job. Thanks for all the effort and thought you put into it. I have a lot of feedback, so get ready. In episode 485, you all discussed owner-builder test. I live in an owner-built house, and I work in a heavily owner-built state of Vermont. I really wish that owner-builders were made to pass some kind of test. I'm all for the creativity and outside-the-box thinking that outsider artist builders can bring to bear, but wow, some of the errors and omissions can be overwhelming. Take my house, for instance. You, Patrick, years ago called the drywall finishing the worst you had ever seen, which I totally agree with, and it is still that way because I can't find the time or inclination to empty the room of all my kids' Legos to make the fix. I had to replace the owner-installed well pump. The plumber said, whoever did this either knew nothing about how to do this or really hated whoever they were installing it for. Just about everything was done wrong. I also replaced the owner-built deck that was framed in Hemlock and rotten after 4 years. The framing layout restarts at every window and door opening, and if you can guess, every sheet of plywood and drywall breaks at the openings, and I've surrendered on fixing the cracked drywall. The stud layout situation is maddeningly when trying to do anything. The house is also lovely, and after no small amount of retrofit work, very airtight and comfortable. The previous owner builder is a friend, and our kids are best friends, so I'm complaining to you knowing he will never listen to this podcast. I'm not angry with him, at least not anymore, but he is not a builder, and he was one of the better owner builders out there from what I have seen. I think people build their dream home believing that it's the last house for them, but they don't either live there forever or things change. It's not the best situation for a buyer to purchase someone else's good enough house, given how expensive repair work is. I really like the Canadian warranty that owner builders have to give. All my issues would have been paid for by not me, but maybe our kids wouldn't be allowed to be friends. So I don't know. I've been working on a massive remodel project for the last 15 months, and it too was an owner-builder structure. It has been a complicated headache-producing nightmare of issues. None of us could have guessed that this was the case because so much care and attention was given to the finishes that we all assumed the structure too was well executed. Not so much. It has been my experience that one of the hardest lessons learned in the trades is patience. One of my mentors was a very patient carpenter, and as my youthful enthusiasm began to morph into benign cynicism, I eventually came to understand that it's best to work a task to total completion before moving on. Others always teased him about being slow, but it didn't take me long to recognize that he worked significantly faster than his detractors once you factored in mistakes and errors and tearing things apart to add in the blocking, for example, for the kitchen cabinets that didn't get installed because hanging the drywall was sexy for the clients to see. I don't see a lot of owner-built structures demonstrating this level of methodical patience, and really, how could they? It's a hard-earned skill to understand that slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Lastly, I've been thinking about the carbon impact of wood pellets after you all read and mulled over my letter about pellet boilers replacing fossil fuel boilers. I looked into it a little and found it instantly overwhelming. The propane advocacy trade group will have you believing propane is not just a great bridge fuel, but the finest fuel ever known. Ditto for pellets. Finding a report that isn't suspect of bias isn't easy. In general, it looks like pellets might be about 50 to 60% less carbon intensive than oil, at least. I don't know how this stacks up against propane. I also don't know at what point in the process it's reasonable to start factoring things in. All this being said, pontificating one way or the other is just not a fun time. It's also clearly out of my depth. I guess I land on the feeling that trees represent a faster carbon cycle compared to any fossil fuel. I don't think we can argue the point that a gallon of fossil fuel burned is gone effectively, forever, from a carbon perspective, but I wouldn't have thought we could argue that the Earth is round either, so... A tree burned is gone for 20 to 50 years, still a long time, but not millions of years long. I think about this a lot. I've landed on thinking that there isn't such a thing as a pretty energy source. A tree looks better as a tree than as pellets, houses, or even cabinetry. Although some of Mike Pekovich's boxes do trees some measure of justice. Oil and gas look better under the ground as permanently stored carbon than it does as a hot world our kids have to adapt to. What's the solution? Please don't ask me, I don't know. That everyone in every company needs to turn a profit makes it hard to tease out what's true and what's corporate spin. And if you actually read this on the air, first round is on me. Well, you got it. Coming to see you, Dave. Oh my gosh, what do you think about this? It's quite a handful. I think that was a hard lesson for me to learn too, is that you got to do stuff right and take your time, right? That's hard.
I think in some ways, though, he's mistaking patience for foresight, which I would say a lot of what he described in that letter is working with someone who has the benefit of experience and can mentally see the work all the way through to its completion. It's not so much patience as knowledge, I believe.
What's the code enforcement like in Vermont? I would imagine in rural areas there aren't building inspectors, or may not be. Yeah.
Is there code enforcement in Vermont, I think, is a better question.
A lot of places now. Burlington has probably got pretty good code enforcement, and maybe some other areas, but it's pretty hit or miss, mostly miss.
I was at a meeting last week with a building officials association group, and at the break, a couple of them were commiserating about homeowners tackling large remodeling projects and how much time it's taking those inspectors, officials, when they're doing the plan review, talking to the owner, well, this isn't really going to work. And then when they go out to do the inspections, how do you break the bad news? Like, you got to take half of this apart because you didn't quite do it right. And so they don't have a solution. What struck me is they're noticing a lot more homeowners, not on a full new build, like Dave's talking about here, but on remodeling projects because they can't find contractors to do the work. So they end up having to do it themselves. A little bigger projects than ordinarily you see a homeowner tackling.
Building inspectors are not equipped to be like building consultants. That's not their job. I respect them for doing that. It's noble work, but I don't know how they can do that.
Yeah, a lot of them around here just adopt the pass or fail mentality of, nope, it's not right.
They won't tell you why it's not right.
Here's the link to the code. Go in there and figure out how to do it. Wow. And that's the code that we have in Wisconsin actually has its own separate addendum for decks, which I suspect they have possibly for that reason of people going out and doing their own decks and missing really important parts of the process.
I can imagine that the building inspectors would prefer if owner builders had some kind of test to pass, because then you can either let them go ahead or say, no, you need to learn more before we can even talk about this.
Well, you know what we should do is send all building officials throughout the whole country a little link to Fine Homebuilding's deck guide and other resources, because really a lot of people don't know when they go on the internet what's a good resource and what's not a good resource.
That is the best idea I've heard all day. Jeff, what do you think about this owner-builder dilemma?
No, I can definitely see where, particularly now that, people are having trouble getting contractors, so they're tackling stuff that they really are not prepared for. Unless you do it a lot, it's easy to even just screw up little things. It's like, and little things can cascade
Even if you
quickly.
do it a lot, it's easy to screw up little things, right, Ian?
Yeah, but I think some of the owner remodelers think it's going to be less expensive for them to not hire a contractor or a general contract it themselves. And that oftentimes isn't the case if you have to go backwards.
That was one of the things my uncle taught my dad, his brother, is like, if this ends up costing more money than it would have to pay someone to do it, it's not worth it. And I think my dad recognized that.
And you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah. This comes from Greg. Patrick and crew, in regards to the pre-filter on the mini split increasing the load on the fan motor, the suggestion that it does is incorrect. The motor load is less if you consider the incoming airflow. Reducing the amount of fluid that the impeller has to move decreases the resistant load. Maybe they are thinking of sucking on a straw. Different principles at work. Take care, Greg. So I get what he's saying. If it's moving less air, it's less load on the motor. But doesn't the incoming air also cool the motor? And if it's restricted, potentially damage it? Am I wrong about that?
I wonder if, well, I'm thinking of my vacuum, my shop vacuum. And when I get a big plug of something in the hose and all of a sudden you hear the motor screaming, does that mean because it's doing less work? Or is it doing more work? Or is that sucking on a straw, which isn't the same thing? I think we need a class in physics from Greg, because this is something that we do a lot. I've done it, putting a pre-filter on a system, and what the impacts are, and is it good or bad for the motor? Is it good or bad for the system? And are we causing more other problems that aren't related to the fan motor itself?
I got taken to task when I was selling, furnace filters at the hardware store for a year by a HVAC tech. He's like, you guys will have these like MERV 3 minimum filters. He's like, we put these in air handlers, they're going to be destroyed. He's like, with the rock catchers, at least, when they get totally occluded, there's still airflow and the coils don't freeze up, and other, maladies that occur with HVAC equipment when it doesn't have sufficient delivery air or supply air. And, so that's where I'm coming from. Any thoughts, anybody?
I think you made a good point, Patrick, about an expensive, large piece of equipment being engineered to work with specific filters as part of the system. So what risk is there when you go outside that pre-engineered, prescribed filter spec?
It's a way more complicated than I certainly understand, and I think even most HVAC technicians, right? This is like, they know that you need airflow for protecting the equipment, but like, I don't know. I've heard that conflicting information that dirty filters filter air better, but then I learned from Allison Bales at the Midwest Building Science Symposium that that's not true, because good filters have an electrostatic quality that dissipates over time. So they stop collecting small particles that are ordinarily caught by the static charge. So I think we need a pro talk. Am I right? Am I right? Yeah. Any engineers
way
out there?
Above my head.
Filter experts is what you need.
Yeah. Our first question comes from Alex. Hello, FHB gang. In my neighborhood, it's not uncommon for an older home to be torn down or almost completely torn down. I know there are cases where an existing home is encroaching upon an existing setback, so a portion of the house is left, grandfathering in the building. But more often than not, I can't figure out why the builders in my area of Silver Spring, Maryland, tear down 80 to 90% of a house just to leave a fraction of it standing. Why would builders do this? What benefit is there leaving just a small portion of a home? It seems like it would make design and demolition costs more expensive. You also wouldn't get a vapor barrier under the older portion of the basement slab, along with a host of other things. Attached are some photographs of a house sitting across the street from me with a front and a side wall left standing. Alex. Oh, I love this question, Alex. Anyone?
Go ahead, Mike.
I was going to wait for you, Ian. Ian sent out an email this morning to a link, and I think it was paralleled my experience, which is, at least in my area, I've seen this happen. I've actually done it, and it has to do with the local regulatory authorities in when you're going to do something to an existing house. And I'll give you a for instance. If I was on a lot and I had an existing house and I wanted to tear it all down, because of zoning changes over time, either minimum lot size or setbacks dimensions, if I tore it down, I would have to comply with new regulations. Whereas if I left up, and it's just a rule of thumb, and I can't find it in the zoning rules, but the local zoning official goes by one wall standing, then it's considered a renovation or a remodel, even if we build this gigantic house on the back of it, and then we can utilize an otherwise non-conforming lot without having to go through zoning approval, and we can also go into setback areas that were grandfathered in. So where today we would have to say 15 or 30 feet off of the property line. So there are lots of different things I've seen around the country and heard from other builders where there are something happening that they have to leave something standing to call it a renovation rather than a new construction.
I think the first time I saw this was on Martha's Vineyard, and it was perhaps in JLC. There was like this scrape off with like one wall that was probably 8 or 10 feet long, braced on both sides so it wouldn't be blown over in the wind. And I was just like, that doesn't make any sense, but that was the reason there too. Have you had to deal with this, Ian?
I have not had to deal with it myself, but I know that in the county I lived in New York, you could get around the Board of Health approvals that are required for your well and septic if you left one standing wall. And those approvals oftentimes would run 6 to 12 months or more. So it was a way to fast track a more or less new home by saving the one wall. When I worked for a house flipper after 2008, that was like his holy grail. His Moby Dick was chasing like the perfect house that he could leave one wall up and then turn it into a multifamily.
I think for Alex to know just what's going on, he could ask the builder or ask the local building official to know what's happening there in his area in Maryland.
Yeah, and his area of Maryland is part of the DMV, the area around Washington, D.C. And when I was there for that conference, just flying into Reagan National and just seeing the amount of building going on out the window and gigantic houses in various stages of construction and townhomes and large commercial developments. It's a pretty intense area of constant construction.
I've heard on a related note, Brian Pontalillo first alerted me to demolition by neglect, which is something they do in Charleston because they have very strict historic districts, and you cannot just mess up stuff. So what often happens is, they'll demo a house and then leave it standing until it is so deficient structurally that then it has to be demolished. And in both cases here, like, I know you have to draw a line at some point, but it seems kind of ridiculous. Am I wrong in saying that?
I don't think you are.
It all depends on the people who live in the area. People in different places are going to have different opinions on how that whole thing's, whether you preserve an old structure or not preserve an old structure. And then that's really what it comes down to. And then the mechanism to do that. And there's no easy answer for that.
It's a great conversation topic. I suspect we'll hear from other listeners who have thoughts on this. And if you all have to deal with this in your work, please write in and tell us what you're doing, why. It's interesting. This comes from Mark. We were talking about Mark's house recently, and he had a follow-up email to the podcast. Hey, guys, thanks for answering my questions. I like the solutions to use beefy hangers to jack up and a jack post to bring up each floor joist. So he was talking about how to strengthen his bouncy floor. I have a few in the basement that aren't being used. I know Mark's the right kind of guy for this, because when you have teleposts in your basement that aren't being used, that's like the person who's perfect for this task. Am I right? I'd love to provide more information on the soffit issue. The roof sections where my soffits are letting in air do not have attic space over them, and the channels were never installed to connect these cavities to the main attic space, so any air coming in is not working its way through the attic. In my bedroom, I actually replaced the insulation in the ceiling. I filled the cavity between the rafters over the top plates with R13 foam board and sealed it up. The rest of that side of the house is still subject to the leakage. Though I will be doing new siding outside, I want to start on that back wall. My plan was either to resheathe with zip system, costly and labor intensive, or apply a liquid WRB. A recent Matt Reisinger video shows a builder closing off the entire soffit area with zip system. I've been renovating the entire house and doing my best to re-insulate and air seal, but I think the most effective efforts will occur when I pull the siding off and apply some kind of WRB from the outside and an air barrier. My goal is to eventually have a conditioned attic so that where my ductwork and HVAC equipment is installed is in a conditioned space. Unfortunately, when I went to make more thermal images, the temperature here in New Jersey dropped significantly, but I still managed to get something. Earlier in the summer, the pictures were more dramatic. I am able to see that my efforts made somewhat of an impact on the bedroom, though. Now I just need to move on to the rest of the house. I've attached photos so you can see the situation better. The whole side of the house is an all addition. I've been recently working in the one bedroom where the pictures are from. The part that has the silver roll roofing over it was a screen porch. All of it has a low-pitch roof that meets up with the main attic. I hope this helps add some context. Love the show, and I value the time and advice you're willing to share. Building science is awesome. Respectfully, Mark. Yes, it is, Mark. Any thoughts, guys? Do you want to describe what's going on here? He's got a low-slope roof, and simply the attic is inaccessible because it's so low-pitch. Is that a simple explanation?
Yeah, I think that covers it as far as his attic is concerned, and the extra pictures gave me some more insight into what he's doing, and I think he's looking to bring that zip or other air sealing, exterior sheathing, membrane, whatever he's going to use, all the way up the wall and then across the face of the soffit, and then I'm guessing lap it onto the roof at some point for his exterior air barrier.
Does that seem like what you are witnessing too, Mike?
Yep. And so he's already done this, sounds like, on the inside of one room, but he isn't going to be able to do it on this other room because the ceiling won't be coming down. So really, you're kind of stuck at that point.
You either got to take this roof sheathing off, or you got to take the ceiling
down. Yep.
Yeah. Or you got to be content with trying to squirt some Pookie in there, sufficiently seal it up, right?
Yeah, that intersection is really hard to seal. We have a DER project that we're working on with a very motivated client to do something to better their house, but we are really struggling with the best way to do that same intersection, whether it be a chainsaw retrofit where you cut the overhangs off and do your work and put the overhangs back on. We haven't quite landed on the right cost versus value metric for which way to go. But for a DIYer who seems to be plenty competent, I think he's got the right idea.
So I'm currently working on a feature with Mike Zanakis, who did a deep energy retrofit on a house in Vermont, which is a cape, and they had to deal with this on a timber frame structure. And what they did is they brought the air barrier up the walls, and then cut it and fitted around the rafters, and resumed it then on the attic side. And it looks like really fussy, unfun work. And I think this project took 3 months with, regular work on it. So it's not easy, fast, or cheap.
And really difficult to do for a one-person DIYer, I would imagine, that cutting all of that sheathing tightly around your rafter tails and then fitting it multiple times probably and taping it and sealing it, that's a lot of work.
You know, we resist recommending closed cell spray foam oftentimes, but sometimes it's the best solution. And, you know, you could have this problem solved perhaps in a day or two with a good insulation crew. And I don't know, that might be the way to go. How do they get access, though?
You're gonna have to pull the whole exterior, you know, the soffit and the frame, and then the roof sheathing. It's one of those projects that you have to nest with the re-roofing project. It seems, you know, if you're going to be replacing the roof, then that's when you do it. You
When
take
the
off
sheathing is already open and you're not going to destroy the roof to get to it. Yeah, I think that's good advice.
Yeah, very early in my career, when I worked for a window manufacturer as an installer, I remember the guy that ran our crew telling one of our clients that as soon as you're going to commit to re-roofing or re-siding your house, that is really the time to look for all the value adds that you can do as part of that project, because you're never going to get another chance to.
What do you guys think of going outsolation? You know, you bring the air and barrier up the wall, and then transition to insulated sheathing at the roof and make the air barrier at that plane. Does that make sense? Yeah.
And there's so many products for that now.
And it makes sense from both thermally and from a building science perspective in a colder climate, because now you don't have that roof sheathing as a potential condensing surface if you've got the insulation above it. And yeah, it can perform real well.
And I've actually read about people leaving the existing roof shingles there and going over that because it doesn't really matter, right? It's you're just starting over again.
Yeah, you're making a big sandwich.
Yeah.
And that's the way my parents' house is. It's an A-frame house with, it just had 2.5 or 3 inches of the old asphalt impregnated fiber board back from the 60s that was essentially the insulation over the planks on the roof. And then we left the original roof there, and then Rick Arnold and I and my father, back in the early 80s, we put on 2x12s, overframed the entire roof, and then insulated from the top. And then sheathed it again. The old roof is still there, and I know it works because there are weeps down at the bottom that occasionally when there is a leak around the skylights, it comes weeping out at the bottom. But hey.
It makes you wonder why we don't build houses like that anyway with a redundant roof, right?
Yeah.
Mark, there's no easy way to do this. I think you got to pick your own course based on your ability and time, because this is, as everyone suggests, going to be a slow process.
Yeah, and the video that he sent us that helped me understand what he was after, I think that's a good method for one competent person to be working on their house.
Can you explain it, please? Ian, I'll have to admit I didn't look at it.
So they showed in, I think it was a remodel, maybe that was a new build in the video, but they showed using zip sheathing on the underside of the soffit so that you could connect it to your zip sheathing on your wall, bringing that air barrier across the bottom of the soffit. And that was where my comment of, I'm guessing he's going to bring it up the fascia and onto the roof to continue it, giving himself that unbroken air barrier perimeter on the outside of the house.
My question is, like, how do you test that you've done an adequate job? Like, I guess you have to do a blower door test once you think your air barrier is intact, and take some measurements, right? I'm guessing you're going to have some thoughts on the next question, Mike. Am I right?
I don't think we have enough time to get to all my thoughts, but we can make a stab at it. Yeah, and it's a short question, so that'll help.
Jim writes in, I spotted this in my neighborhood. This felt has been up there all spring and summer. Is this a good plan? In the photo, it looks brown, but it's actually black felt. That house wrap isn't getting taped either. You know, a house has got to breathe, said Jim.
Oh.
Go ahead, Mike.
So the picture is of a fairly steep pitch roof, and it's got tar paper installed over the whole thing. It looks like they cap fastened it, which is good, but it's been left to the weather for many months, spring and summer, and as Jim mentioned, and so it starts to fade. And okay, so is that a problem? So, of course, my first look was to the code, and of course, there's nothing in the code about how long you can leave the tar paper up there. So then I looked at the Asphalt Roofing Manufacturers Association roofing manual, and it doesn't say anything about time. And I went to a couple of manufacturers' installation instructions of roof shingles, and there's no mention of a time length for tar paper. When you get into the synthetic underlayments, all of them list out something. They'll be 60 days, 90 days, 120 days, and they'll tout the length of time you can leave it exposed to the UV light before it's deteriorated. But tar paper is a generic material. It doesn't have any governing, really there's not much governing its production or anything other than an ASTM standard. In any event, what I look at when I see the picture, because they put a lot of fasteners in it, there are all these little wrinkles, all these little buckling of the tar paper, and that happens over time because there's cellulose in the tar paper. And when it gets wet, either from dew or rain, it starts to expand and it never relaxes and goes flat again. And that is noted in several manufacturers' installation instructions that if there are any if the underlayment has any unevenness, that you have to remedy that, which means in this case, to do it right, they're going to have to take all that tar paper off. And it looked like it had a fastener about every 8 to 12 inches across the whole thing, a cap fastener. So that's going to be a whole lot of peeling off all that stuff. When I was younger and stupid and did a lot of roofing, whenever there would be a warp in our tar paper that we would have dried the roof in, we would take a knife and slice it, and we put the shingles over it. Well, we're counting on that underlayment to maybe do a little bit of secondary water protection, even though we got a bunch of nail holes in it. So that's not a good idea. But so really, it is bad. I mean, Jim's pointing out something we see a lot, especially now. So is it a case where, because the shingles are up there on the roof, is it a case where the builder can't get a sub there because everybody's so busy now, or they didn't schedule properly, or what, you wonder on the labor side, because really you put the underlayment down, even though it's there to dry the roof in, you really want to get the shingles on as soon as possible. But what really struck me, as opposed to the tar paper, is maybe a bigger problem, is that all those roof shingles are up on the roof, and those bundles are laid over the ridge, which you might be able to do for a day, but the shingle manufacturers are very specific. Those bundles have to be dead flat, and they cannot be stored in the sun. A lot of lumber yards, and I recommend this to people, find out where the lumber yard you're buying your shingles from, how they store their materials. If they store them out in the middle of a parking lot, don't buy from that supplier, because that's a violation of the manufacturer's installation instructions. You have to store them
protected
long term anyway, undercover. So those bundles now, all those shingles are going to be bent, and when they get to be installed, when you push them down, there's always going to be a little void potentially in that shingle. So either the nail's going to punch through and break the surface because the shingle's resisting going down when you pop the nail gun on it, or a void will be under there, which later on, when it does settle down, now the nail might be sticking out proud of the surface. All sorts of things that are common. We see it all the time, and it's just not good practice.
What were you going to say, Ian?
I have nothing to say after that. I don't think anyone would have anything to add.
I'm a roofing nerd, sorry.
That's fantastic. I am shocked that the asphalt roofing
Manufacturers Association
doesn't have rules on this. That makes no sense to me.
The pictures that he sent to me looked like a builder who hadn't paid his bills in a while, and his subs walked off his job. Because there was a lot of various stages of of work being done in those pictures.
None of it done.
None of it done, but there was one window that had actually been flashed and taped, but then nothing else had been flashed and taped. So you started to see where some best practices were actually being followed, but then clearly from the picture, nothing had happened there in quite some time.
Taped WRB. Okay, so a WRB can also be an air barrier, but it doesn't have to be. Do we need to tape a WRB if it's not behaving as an air barrier? Can it still function as a WRB?
To my knowledge, there is a minimum overlap that you have to meet for it to be functional as a
And it's more
WRB.
if it's a vertical seam versus a horizontal seam, right? Because we're fighting gravity in that instance.
And depending on the wrap manufacturer, that horizontal joint can be anywhere from 4 to 6 inches, and most of them I think it's about a 12-inch overlap on the vertical. Most of them. Yeah. And I noticed it was kind of hard. Well, you could tell because that particular house wrap's fairly translucent, so you could actually see that it looked like the horizontal might be a little under what it needed to be.
They needed those extra 2 inches to.
So they didn't. Yeah, they could reach up to the soffit. Yeah. I didn't look closely, but depending on, this is another problem with house wrap installation that we see all the time. Both the manufacturers of house wraps and the code requires that whatever your WRB is, it has to go to the top of the top plate of your exterior walls. But a lot of times what happens is the framers are framing, and if they're framing a soffit where the rafters are coming down or the truss tails, and they'll put blocking along the wall to bring that horizontal soffit back, if it has a horizontal soffit, flat soffit. And that's below the top plate. But then the house wrap comes on later and butts up to that. So now that upper part where the soffit is enclosing doesn't have house wrap on it. And you would think, well, it's not going to see water. But sometimes we find where water gets into that soffit area in the winter, freezes a little block of ice, then when it melts, that water travels back to the wall and then gets behind the house wrap, and then all kinds of problems can happen.
I called Steve Basic out at the Midwest Building Science Symposium. He's like, I want to build a house that has porches on all sides, and it's going to be, the ultimate water resistive structure, right? And I was like, until the guy with the pressure washer comes and goes to hose off all these walls that are inevitably going to get dirty because it's all undercover. It doesn't get cleaned by the rain. So, of course, at some point, someone is going to load 1,500 PSI right at the top at that intersection where the soffit meets the wall, right?
In my state, pressure washers who wash houses have to have a registration, kind of like a license. Now,
really?
It doesn't mean they have to be trained to not put 15 or 2,000 PSI against a wall, but we know what the problems are there. And I've got, sometime if you ever want to talk about, I got a whole talk about what happens with pressure washing houses.
Well, let's talk about it.
Okay. I see we got a couple minutes, so I figured it might be a good fill-in. So most of the house wraps, most plastic house wraps work by being hydrophobic. Now, we might get some nerds who listen to the podcast that'll write in, and that'll be good. Yeah, good. So surfactants, which can be soaps, detergents, or even the tannins from wood products, when they reach and get onto the surface of a plastic house wrap, they can change the polarity of the way water behaves on the surface of that house wrap. And there's some really good diagrams that some manufacturers of house wrap have of that process. And what it essentially does is whenever you get a surfactant onto the surface of the house wrap, it can lead to the water, bulk water, actually moving inward right through the house wrap. And when you put the detergent in a pressure washer and you blow it against a building, invariably, like you pointed out, Patrick, water's going to get to that house wrap. And if it has a detergent mixed in, that detergent gets to the house wrap, and all of a sudden, boom, you got a house wrap which isn't going to resist the water as well as it did in its original state. So we have to keep the house wrap clean, but we have to keep it away from any cleaning products.
Wow. So who's thinking about this when they're blasting their siding with a pressure washer?
That's
Nobody.
the thing. I think every pressure washer who washes the exterior of a house needs to have a license and be trained on how not to wreck the house wrap that's underneath.
I got to say, the guy in my neighborhood has had very little training, if I had to guess.
So, soft scrubbing is the best thing. Just use some...
A bucket and a broom, right?
A bucket and a brush. And even if you have detergent, at least you're not blasting it behind the siding. It's just on the surface. So you're not going to cause as much damage if the soap doesn't get to the house wrap.
Jeff, your house is really tall on the backside. I'm guessing you would never attempt to wash it by yourself. Does that mean it just doesn't get washed, or do you have some guy blast it from the ground? No.
It never gets washed.
By the rain. It's washed by the rain.
Yeah. Because I've only got 10-inch overhangs, so.
You know, my neighbor with a pressure washing business, he saw me out on a ladder one day with an RV brush on a broom handle, right? And he's like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "I could wash this house for, a few $100s and your barn." And I was like, "Yeah, thanks, but no thanks."
Smart move. Smart move.
I have very little faith in the integrity of my WRB on the house, especially. I know there are places where there simply isn't one. And I was on a photo shoot one time in California, and this gentleman had a cedar shingle home on it, and I'm sure it got nasty looking, so he had a pressure washing contractor come and wash it out. And I was like, "How'd that work?" He's like, "Oh, it was horrible. Water was running in the house while he was doing it." And I was just like, "Oh, yeah, I'm not surprised." It probably had board sheathing. It might have had no felt paper behind it, right?
Right. You don't know what's behind anything when you're doing that work. You're really taking it into account that the siding is going to stop it all, and it's not going to.
Would you have faith in your zip system, Ian, to shoot it with a pressure washer?
I'm rethinking the amount of faith that I have in it now after listening to Mike.
Yeah, I don't know how the coating that Zip puts on the panel reacts with surfactants. It'd be, the next time we have a Huber person, when we're at the IBS or something and we have a Huber person on, we got to ask him that question.
I think I was going to turn my pressure washer on a piece of zip system and see how it does, right?
You've got to put some wood tannins on it.
Yeah.
What is the most detergent-y detergent, Mike, that you're familiar with? Is it a siding wash? Yeah.
Any of those, siding wash or just regular household dish detergent, or I use dishwasher detergent. So.
Well, sure, we'll hear from the pressure washers trade group, angry emails and cease and desist letters.
Have you, on gable ends, Mike, seen areas where they just stop the
we don't need it up there. Totally.
At the
I have to admit doing that on one house back in the days, back in the 80s when all the house wrap manufacturers used to say, "This is an air sealing product." And we thought, we don't need it up here anymore. Right. It was like magic happened between the 70s and the 80s. I don't know why we quit
paying attention to the builders who had been putting felt paper on gable ends for, a century or more. Like what happened to that knowledge? Why did that suddenly go away?
Because all us young whippersnappers came in and didn't pay attention to what the old guys were doing, or they didn't explain what was the reason the house,
They're just like, this plastic stuff is great. It comes in 9-foot rolls, right? It doesn't blow off in the wind. Did you guys notice if that house wrap had caps, nails on it or staples? Because that's a thing I see all the time is people are using normal staples, and you're not allowed to do that.
Right.
Oh, wow, what a great show. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks to Mike, Ian, and Jeff for joining me, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send us your comments, questions, and suggestions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. And please like, comment, or review us however you're listening. It helps other folks find our podcast. Hey, everybody, stay tuned for the members-only after show if you're a FHB All Access member. We're going to talk about affordable housing, what Ian learned about at the Remodelers Advantage Seminar in the DC area, and it should be an amazing show. Thanks very much for listening. Keep craft alive. Stay safe, everyone.